Welcome back to One Bills Live. We are pleased to be joined now by Sports Illustrated senior NFL writer Conor Orr. Conor, thanks so much for coming on with Chris Trapasso, Steve Tasker. Pleasure to have you on. How are you doing? Good day for you today?
Oh, it's sun is shining. It's a beautiful summer here in New Jersey. No complaints. How about you guys?
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of Hurricane Beryl up here in the Buffalo area. We got it yesterday and today, so we're still recovering. A little cloudy here, but we'll get there. We'll get there. Thanks for coming on. You wrote a nice little article in SI, and it's interesting because there's always this handful of teams who have never won a Super Bowl, Buffalo being one of them, Detroit being one, Cleveland being one. And you went through a list of 12 teams that you think, you know what, these are the 12 teams that really have a shot at it in the current point of history we are in the NFL. You put the Buffalo Bills right behind the Chiefs at number one. Give us an idea of what you think, the common denominator is for all of these teams.
It's interesting. I've gotten into a couple good arguments about this where people are saying, well, theoretically, every team can win the Super Bowl. And yes, there's an element of truth to that. But I think that there are certain owners who spend. There are certain established coach-quarterback combinations, which we know matter. There are teams in a healthy financial situation without a ton of dead cap. Like all these kind of calculations do play in and do factor in. And so you try to take all of those together and you put them into this list of teams that can actually win. And I think it was Robert Saleh who said this last year. He said 8 or 9. I think it's probably closer to 10 to 12 teams every year that you could really honestly look at them and say, okay, these guys are going for it. And they possibly have what it takes.
What I think was really interesting about your write-up to have the Bills at number 2 in this article was you are one of the few national media members that liked the idea of the Bills trading Stephon Diggs. Can you speak to that? Just what was the thought behind that, just from watching last year, or was it projecting forward now, like with Diggs being into his 30s? Do you see a drop-off for him? Explain that, because all we've heard here in Western New York is, the Bills, without Diggs, they're just not going to be the same. So I found that the most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would ask anybody to back that up. I mean, with historical evidence, because I think a lot of times when you empower a quarterback and you let him develop his own wide receivers and you let him develop that kind of unconscious relationship where they are going to be exactly where the quarterback asked them to be, that's 10 times more valuable than just having a superstar established threat. And that's always the hardest thing for fans to digest, going all the way back to Tom Brady's time in New England, when Aaron Rodgers would say time and time again, they're not drafting first-round picks for me. But what the Packers were always getting him were guys like Jordy Nelson. And I don't see a world where someone like Khalil Shakir can't be that kind of guy. I mean, I watched him last year. He was one of my favorite receivers in the draft coming out of Boise State, had these kind of Cooper Kupp after the catch vibes for me. And so I don't understand, if you force these guys to spend a lot of time around Josh Allen, why they can't just be where he needs them to be. And again, that to me is more valuable than, this one singular guy is incredibly talented.
How much stock do you put into the fact that the Bills, with a couple of their significant guys returning, which would be Dalton Kincaid and Khalil Shakir, both those guys, even coming out of college, were the type of guys like they just never drop the ball. They're high efficiency. If the ball's within reach, they almost always pull it in. Is that, I get it. It seems crazy, but catching the ball as a wide receiver or tight end is really important. But by the same token, these guys are way above the curve when it comes to that. How big a factor is that in your evaluation?
It's huge. I mean, look at what we went through with Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs last year, and how, everyone can get on the media for pointing out that, you guys were doubting the Chiefs and they won the Super Bowl, whatever. There was a legitimate stagnancy to that offense because Patrick Mahomes didn't have confidence in his wide receivers. I mean, they were dropping huge game-altering passes week after week after week late in the season, and that can't not impact the way that you operate. And so to have guys with a great catch radius or steady hands, all it does is add to the quarterback's confidence. It allows him to take those chances that he might not normally take, and it just makes everything run smoother. I mean, I don't see a world where, that isn't the most important part. A quarterback letting go of the football and believing to a high degree of certainty that it's going to be caught.
I got to ask you about the New York Jets, the team that you have at third in your article of teams who could realistically win a Super Bowl this year. Steve and I both agree. We think the roster is loaded. Tell me your thoughts about just going into 2024, the Jets, all the Aaron Rodgers saga. How much do you think all those distractions will impact this team? And just how good do you think this team could be?
Well, it's one of those things where it was funny. I was talking to someone about this the other day. If they make the playoffs or they win the division, we're going to say, of course they did. Look at all the stars that they had.
Sure.
And if they implode spectacularly, we're going to say, well, of course they did, because they tried to surround a 40-year-old quarterback coming off a torn Achilles with two 33-year-old offensive tackles playing on wildly unpopular artificial turf. I think I counted the Jets have 4 or 5 games on natural grass this year. So, of course, it was going to go wrong, right? Your number 2 wide receiver is Mike Williams, and that guy doesn't normally finish the season healthy, so it's funny how very different and vastly different the outcomes can be here. But I just think it's hard for me to discount Aaron Rodgers with a veteran team if all things are equal and somehow they remain healthy.
Yeah, and that's really the question. You've got a 41-year-old quarterback, and I've been saying it all this week. He's going to have to take 1,100 snaps to finish an NFL season. That's a lot of football. Now we have seen in recent years in Ben Roethlisberger, in Phillip Rivers, in Tom Brady, Matt Stafford is getting into that range as well. Quarterbacks, particularly quarterbacks in this league, can play longer. They always have been able to, because the physical mobility isn't really a part of the asking. It's not part of the skill set they have to win, because if you can win from the pocket, you can have one leg. But 41, coming off that injury, it really does seem like a precarious spot the Jets are in.
41 coming off that injury, and if you're going to run a version of the offense that Nathaniel Hackett and Rodgers ran together in Green Bay, what you're asking is a lot of lateral movement, right? Because the outside zone, there's a ton of boot action, right? And so you're constantly kind of running that stretch handoff, and then you're kind of back around in the pocket. So if you think about all of that as additional movements that you have to make in the backfield, I mean, I think that's what Rodgers was doing on the play where he tore his Achilles. That's a lot. That's a lot to ask. Now, the one benefit, I think, for Rodgers is once he got really comfortable with Devontae Adams, a lot of his completions were immediate one-step drops coming back from the center where you're not in harm's way at all. You're immediately getting rid of the football. You have a hand signal or a look or whatever you want to do. You're immediately getting your best receiver the ball, and you're no worse for the wear because of it. If he can do that with Garrett Wilson, I think they're going to be fine. But if this is a real traditional boot action, outside zone offense, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of concern about that.
Staying within the division, I got to ask you about the Dolphins, and we're talking about this, which teams could win the Super Bowl. You also wrote 100 bold predictions, and as someone that way back in the day used to write like slideshows for Bleacher Report that were 50 slides long, 100 bold predictions, hats off to you for actually writing that. I urge anyone to go. You will find your team something that Conor has predicted for your team on there. But at 47, you wrote that the Dolphins will struggle to or likely miss their over-under projection on win totals, which is 9.5. Can you talk about just your overarching thoughts on the Dolphins and maybe regressing a little bit this year?
It's hard because the older that this offense gets, and that we've already seen a fairer sample size in this, where the speed-oriented part of this team tends to break down at the end of the season. And, it was interesting. Like, I was looking at what Tyreek Hill does before the snap, and he's in a crouched position outside the tight end. Then he hops up, and then he goes on a dead sprint in motion behind the quarterback, and then another dead sprint out into the field to try to catch a pass. And if you talk to experts, let's say that coach track and field for a living, for example, and you ask them to take a look at that repetitive motion over and over and over and over again, it's hard to maintain health and consistency and, volume. And so, as ingenious of the design of this team as it was, we've just seen them kind of struggle in November, December, and January when the wear and tear of this sprinting and this heavy kind of athleticism kind of takes its toll. And I've been wondering for years kind of when they're going to add that power element to the game where they can kind of spell themselves a little bit when you get into the winter months.
That's a really good point.
What and of your 100 bold predictions, which one have you got the most negative feedback about? I mean, you've got, because I know when you put out these bold predictions, I mean, you're almost inviting the slings and arrows of of fortune. So give us an idea of what really struck a nerve with a lot of people.
It's funny, like, in the back end of it, every year I'll put like a joke. Like one year I was like, oh, your wife will leave you for a Peloton instructor or something like that, just like a
Just to
joke.
get to 100.
And yeah, I mean, it's hard to get to 100. And so with that, like, it's a little tongue in cheeky. And so to see people debating it so seriously, makes me laugh. But I think Joe Burrow, having MVP consideration had a lot of people pretty hot. Just my general love of the Bengals seemed to get a lot of people upset. And just the random ones too. I think everyone was kind of mad that I had like, Rashad Penny having like a 300-yard rushing game. But who's to say what's going to happen in November when like everyone's hurt? I mean, I remember as a kid growing up a Browns fan and like Lee Suggs running for 220 yards at the end of a game during a season. You never know what could happen. So
Right.
True. Last one for me. This was not anything from what you've written, so I'll give you some time to think about it. Besides the Chiefs, of course, because they're at the top, what other team do you think is the biggest competitor for the Bills inside the AFC? Is it the Bengals? Maybe it is, because you mentioned that you're really high on them. Is it the Ravens, the Jets? Which team? Because I wrote this article a few weeks ago, and I'm just wondering, I kind of want to pull other national media members. What other team do you think is the stiffest competition for the Bills this season in the AFC?
I mean, I think it's whoever survives the North, right? And
Okay.
I think
That
that's
makes
really
sense.
stereotypically how it's been. And the North, there's so much vacillation there built in. Like, I didn't list the Steelers, for example, as a team that could win the Super Bowl. But if Russell Wilson goes 26-8, like with touchdown to interception, like he did in Denver last year, that's a team that could make the AFC Championship. I mean, Kenny Pickett threw 7 touchdowns last year. That's ridiculous. And so if you think about it from that perspective, whatever team kind of finishes beating themselves up and survives that division, I always feel is like the most battle tested. And then you have Buffalo and you have Kansas City, and that kind of rounds out that elite upper core of the division. I think Houston, to me, is still another year away, and we'll see what happens there. I mean, they were a win away from, the Colts winning that division, right? And the Colts scored 20 more points than the Texans did last year. The Texans now have the hardest schedule in their division. So I don't see them as there quite yet. I think it really is the Bills, the Chiefs, and that AFC North.
So as you look at the AFC East, and this is kind of where we live, obviously. I think your opinion about how the East is going to turn out for anybody, not just you, but anybody, depends on your confidence that the Jets can keep Aaron Rodgers on 2 good wheels, and how you feel about the Dolphins overall. The Patriots everybody kind of sets them to the side as in they're in a rebuilding project, and the Bills are the 4-time champions. So, and however much you discount them for the offseason they've had, but it really comes down to where you put the Dolphins and the Jets and how much confidence you have in a 41-year-old quarterback. And in the Dolphins, like you said, can they keep on keeping on and finish games? Where do you stand on the AFC East? Certainly, not everybody's picking the Bills, and a lot of people are picking the Dolphins and the Jets to supersede them. What do you think?
I have the Bills and the Jets as kind of my 1 and 1A there, and I think that again, I mean, I'm leaning not only on Aaron Rodgers being healthy, but I think what we're not talking a lot about there is this is as deep a defense as Robert Saleh has ever had. I would argue that it's probably as good, if not slightly better, than the defense that he had coached with the 49ers the year that they made the Super Bowl against Kansas City. Assuming some of those pass rushers are going to take the next step there, but that team is very, very deep. They have like hockey line style depth at defensive line. I think they're very, very talented. And so even if Aaron Rodgers goes down, a 40-year-old Aaron Rodgers versus Tyrod Taylor, I mean, there's obviously a drop-off there, but, I mean, they almost beat the Chiefs with Zach Wilson last year. They beat the Eagles with Zach Wilson last year. This was not a bad football team. So I have the Jets and the Bills as sort of my 1 and 1A. I would guess that 1 or 2 divisional games sort of decide that. And then the Dolphins are very clearly my 3, and Patriots really clearly my 4.
All right.
Hey, Connor, thanks for joining us.
Great
Really
interview.
appreciate you giving
Great
us some
interview.
time, and hope we can cross paths again during the preseason or sometime during the regular season.
All right, we'll see you after I make my trip to Bar Bill in a couple weeks.